As you all heard on Friday, he still continues to cast false blame on Maureen for his problems. To him, she was the reason he had no money, and the reason why he couldn't get steady employment, and the reason he couldn't stay in the house. And now to him, Maureen is the reason that he sits before you. All he did, all he still does, is blame her. But he alone is to blame for all of his problems. What he did is the sole reason that he sits before you all. He is responsible for the desperate and despicable place that he brought himself to. And he is solely responsible for his wife's death because he murdered her. Maureen Argie didn't take her own life. She had her life stolen from her. A new life, a life that she had every reason to live for. And a new life that she had every reason to look forward to. Because it was going to be a life free from the anchor who had weighed her and her children down for so long. And he was that anchor, draining them of their money, of their home, of their future. And she finally was going to cut that anchor free. And he would not allow that. So he squeezed the life out of his wife while she slept and was at her most vulnerable. He took Maureen's life while the children, who she cared so much for and had every reason to live for, slept just down the hall. That is what the credible and reliable evidence presented to you last week has proven beyond a reasonable doubt. He had the intent to kill, he had motive to kill, he had opportunity, and he had the means. And he followed through with all the hatred and resentment on his mind that he expressed in so many ways to so many people for so long. He violently lashed out at the woman who he blamed for all of his own many failures, and who he also believed was about to take from him what little he had left. He would not let Maureen win. He could not let her be free and happy, and that ultimately is why he murdered her. You all know that he killed his wife and why he did so. After Friday, none of you should have any doubt as to that. After hearing and seeing the powerful medical evidence, which corroborated all the non-medical evidence that you had heard up to that point, and after hearing his self-serving and desperate lies to you. But we ask that you bear with us over the next hour or so as we discuss some of the evidence you saw and heard of his guilt, and also address claims and arguments raised by the defense. First, we're going to dispose of this ridiculous claim that Maureen died by suicide. Second, we'll go through all the medical and other evidence that establishes that Maureen was the victim of a homicide. Third, we're going to catalog all the other evidence that establishes his guilt of murder, his motivations for wanting the victim dead, his prior threatening and hostile statements against her, his recruitment of a friend to kill her, and all of his guilty and callous actions after the crime. And last, we're going to explain why the killing committed by the defendant is first-degree purposeful murder. So let's begin with the defense claim in this case. Maureen Argie took her own life. From the tale that finally came out on Friday, it's a ridiculous story wholly made up from his guilty imagination. And it's also demeaning and it's insulting, not only to the credible evidence and to your own common sense, but also to who Maureen truly was. It's a smear attack on the character of someone who he made damn sure cannot defend herself. It's just what you would expect from the same bitter, self-centered man who held Maureen and her children down for so long. It's more false blame casting by the man who constantly did that up until he killed her and continued even after her death, what you all heard from him on Friday. Did witnesses report Maureen as being sad? Was she depressed at times? Yes. And who the hell wouldn't be? Stuck in a dead-end marriage, quickly going further downhill, tied to an emotionally abusive spouse who is bleeding the family dry financially. In terms of such expected sadness, draw on your own common sense and life experiences. Most people have had it, either personally or through others, whether brought by a particular relationship, marriage, dating, family, employment, or by something else. The poor relationship obviously does not make you feel giddy. It makes you feel down, sad, depressed. Otherwise, it would be a good relationship, not a bad relationship. It should not have to be said that sadness and depression are worlds apart from suicidal. It is just as absurd as the attempt to twist Maureen's quiet temperament into some sort of suicidal disposition. Oh, so she was quiet, so she must have been mentally weak, so she was suicidal. It is insulting. And that wholly illogical leap from sadness, depression, to suicide is even more so since Maureen was finally leaving the source of the to-be-expected sadness. Him. That gave her hope, optimism for her and her kids, control over her life, security, things that she didn't have in her toxic relationship with him. Which all leads to the obvious question. Maureen was suicidal over what exactly? Why was she suicidal? It should not surprise you that every single person who truly knew Maureen, who spent time with her, who saw Maureen in a relationship with her kids who meant everything to her, all those people who talked to Maureen in the days leading up to her murder, and with whom she discussed private matters such as the intended divorce, as well as her plans and hopes moving forward from it and from him. All those people who truly cared about Maureen and knew her closely, who accurately knew her as a loving mother, a strong person, every single one of those credible and reliable witnesses who did know and would know Maureen best scoffed at the notion that Maureen Argie would ever take her own life, as should each one of you. They told you about how they supported Maureen and were always there for her. They told you about Maureen's plans and intentions, all positive and forward-thinking. Never a hint of suicide. Not once, not ever. No direct threats of suicide, no suicidal talk, no observed conduct or behavior even suggesting that extreme state of mind, no motive, whether rational or not, to take her life. Nobody saw or heard anything remotely hinting at self-harm. And it wasn't because she was a quiet person who never talked about her problems. You heard last week from witnesses who knew her. She shared her fears, her concerns, her hopes, her intentions, and plans with friends and family members. Nobody saw or heard anything remotely suggesting suicide because she was never suicidal. Not once, not ever. You heard from the medical examiner, who we'll get to shortly. Zero evidence of suicide. Forensic findings that were in fact contrary to suicide. A 41-year-old mother with absolutely no history or expressions or signs of suicidality, either from those who knew her best or from her medical history. We gave you Maureen's private records dating back years and years, over 500 pages of medical records. In those records spanning the last decade of Maureen's life, two brief references to expressed depression related to marriage. Again, who wouldn't be depressed and sad? And there are multiple medical references to no experienced depression. Depression does not equal suicidal. Quiet does not equal suicidal. Not even close. Maureen was not a tortured soul fighting suicidal urges at any time in the 40-plus years that she lived on this earth. Not once, not ever. You also heard how Maureen had a support system fully behind her. Many close friends and family members who were always there for her. And she had long-term and steady employment. She had a full-time job that she enjoyed, with a desired promotion at hand. She had those 2 young kids who she never would have left behind or to him. And she was moving on and forward with those kids, getting away from the bitter narcissist who demeaned and belittled her and squandered the family's resources. What from all this even remotely suggests suicidal? Nothing. 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 Next on this nonsense of suicide, last week you all heard from Maureen in her own words. The call she placed to the police before her death. Not only what she said, but how she said it. Firsthand, you all heard Maureen's tone and demeanor in that call. That was not a call made by someone who was remotely contemplating taking her own life. You heard it was the very opposite. It was a call from someone wanting to ensure her future well-being. Now, as an important aside to this false suicide claim, contrast the recording of Maureen with the recording you heard from him. Not a 911 call, because you know he never cared to make one for his own dead wife, or any other calls that someone who remotely cared would have made. And you heard his callous answers with that. What difference would it have made? How many of you would feel that? You heard from people who truly cared for Maureen, her brother, her mother. It would have mattered to anyone who really cared. And his other explanation, didn't want to create a scene. Didn't want to create a scene. That is exactly what he did when he abandoned his dead wife and left behind that bloody trail in his home. And when his actions caused confusion and concern by multiple others, required the police to break into the house and prompted a multi-state manhunt for him. No, the words from him that we're talking about is the call that he made to his close friend, Ray Karen. You heard the defendant avoid the question, what happened to Maureen? Not wanting to speak on a line because he believed it might be recorded. Feigning that he was unaware that she was dead until the police told him. The call was not a direct admission of wrongdoing, but it was damning. You all could read between his lines, just like his friend Ray did. Nothing in that call suggests innocence. Someone who did not do anything would not have been speaking the way you heard him talk. Deflecting questions, changing the subject, lying. It was a guilty person who knew that he was guilty, being evasive and avoiding answering for what he did. Getting back to this suicide trash, and getting back to Maureen and what she said. You also have her conversations with close friends days before her death. making sure that no firearms were in the house. Not out of a concern that she may try to harm herself, not at all. Instead, making sure that he did not have access to weapons. And he did not, which is why he did not put a bullet in Maureen's brain while she slept and then turn the gun on himself. And which is why he resorted to the murder available to him, asphyxiation while she was completely helpless. Suicide. The defense may well have been that Maureen died of natural causes, a broken heart. On a scale of absurdity and actual support by credible and reliable evidence, death by broken heart is at this same level as this claim of suicide. Utter nonsense. It all goes back to this. Maureen Argie committed suicide because. Soon we'll get into all the reasons why the defendant harbored and actually expressed homicidal intent against his wife. Certainly not rational reasons to take another person's life. But as we'll touch on shortly, murder is not a rational crime. You all know the reasons in the defendant's selfish mind he despised and resented his wife. Toss aside this desperate claim of her sudden, rapid, drastic, unexpected, unforeseeable descent into suicide for the utter nonsense that it is. Oh, I told her it was going to be a fight. And that mentally frail person that she was, she gave up on life itself. You all got fair pictures of who Maureen really was from all those who knew her best. No way that would have happened. And you all know that Maureen was well aware that he was and would continue to be disagreeable, confrontational, hateful, spiteful, and selfish. Only with his overinflated sense of self-importance would the defendant think this sham of suicide really worked. You all know that Maureen Argie had every reason to look forward to her life without him continuing to drag her and her kids down. This was no suicide. Next, let's discuss the medical evidence. First, briefly addressing the challenges to Dr. James's expertise. You heard something in the opening statements to the effect that Dr. James hadn't been practicing medicine for 2 years. That just wasn't true. They tried to suggest that she wasn't a medical doctor. Again, untrue. Anyway, such nights should have as much effect on you as they did with Dr. James. Absolutely not. You heard about her education, her training focused on forensic pathology, and her professional experience, which has continued. Triple board certified, over 1,000 autopsies, including many, many hangings. That expert carefully detailed with you the thorough medical examination that she conducted. An exam that went beyond what she observed and documented during her exhaustive physical investigation of Maureen's body. Dr. James reviewed photos taken of Maureen where she had been found. Dr. James also reviewed Maureen's medical history. And Dr. James also waited for the toxicology results. The other expert witness who you've heard from, and those findings are highly relevant. The most expansive screening available was used for that toxicology, and nothing but caffeine was found in Maureen's system. No prescription medications, no illicit drugs, no alcohol. Absolutely nothing that could have adversely altered Maureen's consistent mental state, which was wholly at odds with suicide. Getting back to Dr. James, she provided to you a complete, expert, and fully reliable explanation for why she ruled out all possible manners of death other than homicide, including suicide. There was no furrow, there was no blanching, there was not even any abrasions on Maureen's neck. The numerous abrasions to her face were inconsistent with hanging. You saw the contusion and underlying deep muscle hemorrhaging, indicating manual strangulation, not ligature strangulation like hanging. And Maureen sure as hell did not throttle herself to death, although that ridiculous scenario is on par with what the defendant has tried to sell you with this suicide story. But getting back to the credible and the reliable evidence, you also saw, and Dr. James explained, the asymmetrical trauma to Maureen's neck. More reliable medical evidence at direct odds with this claim of hanging. And Dr. James also explained why she initially qualified her finding as to Maureen's cause of death. You saw for yourselves the trauma to Maureen's neck and face. Injuries that, taken as a whole, showed that Maureen had been attacked. But Dr. James wasn't gunning for or pressured towards a particular medical conclusion. She actually was cautious, and her initial opinion as to cause of death reflected that. An opinion that still establishes, along with all the other evidence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Dr. James followed the medical evidence where it went. Lividity due to how the defendant left his victim's body obscured any particular hemorrhaging in Maureen's eyes. And Dr. James explained that she initially believed that the observed trauma to her nose may have been, not have been petechiae due to increased pressure. Simply put, he caught a slight forensic break. A minor factual loophole that he's trying to inflate and exploit by falsely blaming his victim. Dr. James just could not tell you exactly how Maureen was killed, which you know is a burden that we do not have under the law. Our burden here is that death was caused by strangulation or smothering, no more, which we note is the same cause relied on for this claimed defense of suicide. The defense is not challenging her cause of death, which was initially qualified. And as to the conclusion that Maureen died by homicide rather than suicide, Dr. James was unequivocally certain. She was back in 2019. She was on the stand with you on Friday. It was homicide. She was certain then and back on Friday, as should each one of you. After all, you each have been privy to highly relevant evidence of murder that was not part of Dr. James' thorough and professional medical analysis. And we will catalog all that other non-medical evidence of murder very shortly. But you know that you can trust the medical evidence in Dr. James' expert findings because they fit like a glove all the other evidence that Maureen was murdered. And more specifically, that he murdered her. His actions after her death, his multiple motives to cause her harm, his expressed hatred against her, his solicitation to kill her. As to physical evidence supporting the reliable medical findings, Maureen wasn't found hanging by any credible witness in any remotely plausible manner. There was no ligature around her neck needed for a hanging to occur. No ligature was anywhere to be found in the house. And you heard his attempt to explain that away. For some inexplicable reason, he packed it up with him. A sheet. He packed up a sheet when he abandoned his dead wife. And then he left it. Left it somewhere. There was no suicide note. You saw all of Maureen's actual writings at around that time, the emails that she sent to friends and family members. She had made plans for that coming weekend and beyond. She also had made plans that night with his sister and mother. A clear intent to continue living her life, expressed that very day when she was last seen alive. She was moving on and rightly optimistic about it. You saw, in the crime scene photos, Maureen had set her clothes out for the next day, laid out on the bathroom counter. As clear a sign of her intent as everything else she had talked to with others in the preceding days. To divorce him, to move away from him, to continue to care for her kids, to move up at work, to move on with her life. You heard the defense opening last Monday. Imagine the strength that it must have taken Bill to keep it together. Strength as in courage. How utterly insulting. You are going to have to imagine this killer's courage because this story is a complete figment of his imagination. From the credible evidence, you know the absolute callousness, you know the absolute selfishness, you know the absolute opposite of courage it did take for him to abandon his dead wife and kids and fund that gambling trip on her debit card. Medical evidence. Where was Dr. James' conclusion ruling out suicide deficient? Where did she err? What credible information did she overlook? Nowhere and nothing. You all know, as did Dr. James after her thorough examination, that Maureen died at the hands of another. She was the victim of homicide, not suicide. And lastly, with respect to the medical evidence, how exactly did the defendant kill his wife? Now, going back to something that we talked to each one of you about when we first met you weeks ago, we don't have to prove the exact mechanism of death. That is not one of the elements of the charged murder that we have to prove at all. And that should make sense to you. A murderer should not benefit from efforts to conceal a crime, or to commit it in private, or from questions that cannot be answered even through thorough forensic analysis. Only one person exactly knows how that murder was committed. But from the medical evidence and the physical evidence, we'll posit to you how the defendant killed his wife. A basic and deadly chokehold, as a result of which Maureen lost consciousness in seconds, and there was no opportunity for Maureen to struggle. And add to that, he attacked her while she was asleep and utterly defenseless. She was in bed and sleepwear. Now, if you recall, and I'll use my colleague briefly for this, the trauma to Maureen's neck was on her right side. He is right-handed. She was asleep in bed. All he had to do, with his arm around her neck, press her face into the bed and pillow, and put his body weight on hers. And that's how he did it. His body weight, his full body weight on hers, his arm locked into her throat. She was unable to flee. She was unable to fight him off. And she was unable to cry for help. You have the medical evidence of what little struggle Maureen could muster in her utterly helpless state underneath him in those moments before she passed out. The abrasions to her face and the contusion to her tongue. Suffered while she was instinctively thrashing her face as he pressed it into the mattress in the few seconds before succumbing to unconsciousness, trying desperately to free herself as he pressed his arm into her throat. His bicep, the pressure point that inflicted the asymmetrical contusion in the internal hemorrhaging to the right side of her neck, and cut off air to her brain through her carotid artery. You heard from Dr. James. 11 pounds of pressure, seconds needed. That's all it took, like crimping a garden hose. Within seconds, Maureen was unconscious, and then when she was absolutely helpless, he continued to squeeze. The seconds turning to minutes until he was sure that she was dead. And that's likely how the defendant murdered his wife. Not that we have to prove it. Now contrast this horrific but forensically grounded scenario with this claim of suicide. A claim that is at odds with both the reliable evidence and with common sense. Do any of you understand how this claimed suicide possibly could have happened? It is frankly confusing to try to explain it because it defies physics and it defies physiology. Maureen tied a long bed sheet to her neck and secured the other end to the bedpost, which was at a height far shorter than she was. And then I guess she must have rolled off a bed to hang herself, somehow striking her neck with such great force to cause the documented contusion and internal muscle bleeding that you saw, but not causing any furrow or even abrasions to her neck. And then somehow her entire body was suspended. I suppose it had to be horizontally because she rolled off the bed from a height of a few feet, while also wedged apparently in between the bed and the nightstand. It would be comical if he were not trying to get away with murder. That's some comments on the medical evidence, what it proved and also what it disproved. Now let's turn to the non-medical evidence you saw and heard. You absolutely know that he killed his wife from all the other evidence of murder that Dr. James did not have or use when she concluded, based on the medical evidence, that Maureen Argie died by homicide. The powerful non-expert evidence, like his relationship with Maureen. It had reached a toxic level, and it had been that way for quite some time. You heard how the defendant constantly demeaned and denigrated Maureen, and you know how he really felt about her, and you know all that he blamed her for. Told to you by those closest to him who would know. And that poisoned relationship was about to end in his selfish and bitter mind in a victory for Maureen. And that he would not accept. You all bring life experience to the table. Unfortunately, you probably all know situations, and even probably been in situations where a relationship becomes toxic. People who once professed love for one another can't stand the sight of each other. One blames the other for everything. And add to that volatile situation, children, custody of children, support of children. You all know the irrational hatred, animosity, and resentment that can and does develop. And add to that for him all the other stressors occurring and increasing in severity at the same time. Job, finances, simply where to live. Granted, most cases of failed relationships do not result in violence, let alone murder. But you all know that sometimes it does. And you all heard and saw last week why this was not most cases. You heard and saw last week for him why he chose to resort to violence. It is a simple argument. Why resort to violence? Why resort to the ultimate act of violence? Why indeed? Is there ever a good reason for domestic violence? Is there logic behind domestic violence? When you come across an unfortunate but not uncommon news account of a murder-suicide, do you think to yourselves, well, that makes sense. That's a rational outcome. As in many cases here, the relationship is proof of his murder. Next, his financial straits. The employment that had to a degree covered up his gambling losses in the past, those jobs had dried up. He wasn't getting steady work, and he had not been for quite some time. And add to that, he was already underwater financially. You saw his bank statements and the accurate and desperate picture they portrayed in those first months of 2019. From bad to worse, literally less than zero to his name. Losing his home of many years, losing his new truck, he couldn't cover a $20 gym fee. And with that pending divorce, he knew that as low as he was money-wise, it would only get worse. First, he would lose access to Maureen's steady income. As much as he had belittled her pay in the past, it was more than he was getting, and he was about to get cut off. Also, as to any division of actual assets, to the extent that he already had gambled them away, he knew half was less than all. And last, child support. As much as you saw and heard he did not want to pay child support for the kids, he was going to have to. Especially if he tried to follow through with this often expressed pipe dream of moving down south. If he left, no way would he be able to take the kids, and he would have had to pay the child support that he had repeatedly and adamantly said that he would never do. He knew that all that would leave him even less money for his true loves, himself and his gambling. And as you heard from his friends and family who knew him best, he was all about the money. You know, many of you likely have had financial difficulty at some point in time. An overdrawn check, high credit card balance, debts such as student loans, car payment, mortgage. You know how stressful that can be. It was the same for him, except multiplied many times over and getting worse. No light at the end of the tunnels, only more darkness. And that was in addition to the other stressors in his life occurring at the same time. The failed marriage, his perceived belief that his relatives were taking Maureen's side. All the more evidence of his motivation and reason to commit murder. We have said this before, we will say it again. Not logical reasons or motivations. Murder is not a logical crime. That reality does not change either that people do in fact act out violently, including against loved ones, and that they do so because of financial and marital strife. That's what happened here. And that his killing wasn't logically motivated doesn't make the murder that he committed any less than first-degree murder, which we'll talk about at the end. Next, let's discuss his gambling. And although this is tied to his deepening financial crisis, the gambling provides separate reasons for his crime. Not that he would admit it to you, but you heard from credible and reliable witnesses, both friends and family members, he lost a great deal of money. And despite pleas from family and friends to stop, he continued to gamble. And he was losing money that he didn't have. You also know the impact and consequences of that gambling. You know that understandably it added to the strife and conflict and tension between he and Maureen. And his gambling issues and their extent provides further motive for his extreme conduct against her, like the drug addict stealing from loved ones or engaging at a knife-point robbery to get money to pay for the next fix. His focus on gambling explains extreme and desperate conduct. It does not excuse conduct, it's not a defense, and it doesn't lessen the degree of murder that he committed. Now, first, as to gambling, yet another source of extraordinary stress and dysfunction for him. And second, with respect to gambling, you heard how he was contemplating addressing his gambling issues. Not by stopping, not by openly getting help, not by truly getting help, which he openly refused to do, but by acquiring a new source of income to literally bring to the poker table. That $400,000 life insurance policy on his wife's life. That large amount of money was on his mind well before he killed Maureen. He thought of her life as an available financial windfall, a lottery ticket. We are not saying that when he was choking the life out of his wife, he was thinking to himself, I'm going to get that $400,000. That's not what we're saying. Rather, the fact that he was actively contemplating killing her for insurance money shows how extreme his level in contempt and disdain towards her had become, as well as his long-brewing intent to cause her harm. Maureen was no longer his wife. She was a means to an end. She was a pile of poker chips that he was waiting to cash in. And that's how he viewed his wife 2 months before he killed her. And again, you know that his hatred and scorn towards her only continued to grow in that interim, when the marriage issues came to a head, when his financial straits worsened. That is how his gambling played a role in the murder that he committed. You know, we've gone through all these many significant stressors in his life that were increasing in intensity leading up to Maureen's death. And you know that Maureen had a support system, the many close friends and family members who helped her and who were there for her. And contrast that with what the defendant had or believed he had at the time, which was nothing. He had gambling associates. They took his money, and he owed money to them, money that he didn't have. The friends that he used to have, he believed they betrayed him, and he cut off ties with them. And his family, in his selfish and spiteful mind, he truly believed that by helping Maureen and the kids, his family was stabbing him in the back. You saw his text messages to his mother just days before the murder. This misguided sense of betrayal only added to his already high degree of anger and resentment, which, not surprisingly, he chose to focus on Maureen. The defendant had long festering and growing spite and hostility towards his wife. She was never good enough. She wasn't attractive enough. She didn't make enough money for him. And he had growing bitterness towards the life he knew she was going to live apart from him successfully with the kids, with help from his family. Now, his anger and resentment towards Maureen manifested itself in so many ways, both in his words and in his conduct. And all that came to play on the last night of Maureen's life. It all reached for him a tipping point that he was not going to accept. Not a boiling point. That suggests in some way that he snapped. That suggests that what he did was sudden, or something less than first-degree murder. It was not. He exhibited hate, resentment, and a desire to kill Maureen long before he ultimately acted. You know, the defendant's talk of suicide to his neighbor, Mr. Lang, about a week before the murder is so telling on many different levels. First, it reveals how quickly and extremely his life was unraveled, that he would voice such drastic thoughts so openly. And in that week before the murder, it only became worse for him. His open suicidal statements also were another example of the extreme degree of resentment he held against Maureen. If you recall the statements, the thought was by him was that by killing himself would be in some way a way to cause Maureen pain. And his remarks also demonstrate his extreme conceit, a belief by him, and only him, that Maureen just could not go on without him. And that warped sense of self-importance quickly was coming crashing down with the reality that, yeah, Maureen was moving on, and yup, she was taking the kids, and yup, he was being exiled to his mom's vacation home. In the days that followed his troubling suicidal statements, Maureen moved belongings from the house. She finalized plans to move in with his family. She went forward to putting the house on the market. He realized that she could and would be moving on without him. He could not stand that. He would not let that happen, and he chose the ultimate way to hurt her. In his mind, she was taking everything he had left: kids, family support, home, and most importantly to him, money. And all this evidence of motive came from his friends and from his family members. None of it was made up or exaggerated. That was what happened. Which takes us to the contrary evidence, his self-serving lies that you heard on Friday. A story never before told to Maureen's family and friends. A story never before told to his family and friends. You have all that evidence refuting suicide and proving homicide. Police officers, civilians, expert and technical witnesses, and also those closest to the defendant and his victim. His own statements, what he said, as well as what he wrote in text in that recorded conversation with Mr. Karen. You have all that credible and reliable evidence of guilt against his word. The only witness out of the dozens who you heard from with any motive to lie. The only witness with an absolutely powerful motive to lie. To get away with murder. Someone who revealed this self-serving, ridiculous tale of suicide, not to friends like Ray Karen, not to family, but to you. And as he made abundantly clear on Friday, and also made very easy for you to resolve, someone is lying. He never said he didn't want to pay child support. Well, you heard different from his best friend at the time, Dan LaRochelle. And you also heard different from his sister, Karen Argie, the one he made sure to make petty attacks on Friday. With Karen Argie, you actually saw the text message that he wrote to her mother minutes before the conversation with the defendant, in which the defendant said there was no way he was going to pay child support. And you also heard differently from Kelly Hobbs, his other sister, who he apparently forgot to disparage on Friday. Who was lying? All three of them or him? And don't forget here, the documentation that he forgot. Remember what was found in the house? The divorce paperwork. The divorce paperwork he filled out in which he indicated no child support. Documentation. He never made threats against Maureen that Dan LaRochelle told you about. Well, you heard from Mr. LaRochelle, someone unlike the defendant with absolutely no motive to lie. He never solicited James Timbus to commit murder. Again, Mr. Timbus, someone with absolutely no motive to lie. The defendant himself could not come up with a single reason when asked. And although not needed, Mr. Timbus had documentation. The text message exchange about their meeting that he saved on his cell phone. And Mr. Timbus also had powerful corroboration. The actual existence of the very life insurance policy that the defendant had talked to him about. How would Mr. Timbus know the life insurance policy? And recall one of the other details that Mr. Timbus shared with you. The defendant's proposition for murder included his desire to make it look like a suicide. Now, here's the defendant trying to convince you on Friday that his wife's murder was a suicide. Who was being truthful? Him? Or basically every one of his friends and family who you heard from last week? And you also have his word in direct conflict with objective and reliable record evidence. The proof that he, not some unknown thief, used his dead wife's debit card. Well, you know why he would deny those purchases. It shows just how selfish and cold-blooded he was. It's despicable conduct showing an utter lack of caring. Like attempting to portray Maureen as an alcoholic, neglectful mother who was passed out on the couch while he cared for and frolicked with his kids. Not that he ever tried to do that on Friday, right? That was me, not him. You saw the cell tower data from Tracy Flaherty showing that his and Maureen's cell phone went with him from the house southward to Nashua, and were in the Hudson area within minutes of the purchase at Dunkin' Donuts that was used by Maureen's debit card. And you know that he spent the night in Foxwoods. The cell tower data showed that he was in Connecticut on April 4th. Police ultimately found him there the next day. You know, his attempts to play with the dates on Maureen's bank records, which reflect when the purchases ultimately posted on her bank account, not when they were made, are as desperate and ineffective as his efforts to stake his credibility against those of his closest friends and family members. Some unknown thief was not following Bill Argie to Foxwoods. You all know who lied to you last week. The only person with any motive to do so. The person who wants to get away with the murder that he committed. Now, lastly, on the text of the witnesses who told you about his threats, that nobody came forward to report what he said before Maureen's murder does not make what they reported to the police and told you about last week untrue. Oh, Mr. Timbers didn't come forward back in February. Well, he told you why. He didn't think the defendant actually would follow through with his threats. That doesn't mean either that what Mr. Timbers testified to did not happen or that the defendant did not mean it. You know, maybe Mr. Timbers should have reported what the defendant said to him back in February. But neither did the defendant's best friend, Dan LaRochelle, go to the police when the defendant voiced threats of violence towards Maureen to him. Although you heard that Mr. LaRochelle made sure to take steps to ensure Maureen's safety after that intervention. And you also heard his haunting words to Maureen when she told him that the defendant wouldn't hurt her. Mr. LaRochelle's response, his best friend's response, Maureen, you're wrong. And neither did the defendant's friend and neighbor, Mr. Lang, go to the police when he heard the defendant talk about taking his own life to harm Maureen just a week before his botched suicide. They all thought he would calm down, that rationality would set in. You know, tragically, in many domestic violence situations, hindsight is always 20/20. And you also have something that these various people who heard the direct threats to Maureen voiced by the defendant didn't have. You all have the complete picture. They didn't know about each other, or what the defendant was saying to other friends and family members. They didn't know that his threats were not isolated instances, and that his hatred and anger were not exaggerated, but rather was what he was saying to anyone and everyone, friends, family, associates. And none of them knew the full nature and degree of the various stressors in the defendant's life, just how dire his job, his money, his relationship problems were. None of those witnesses had the full picture of the real danger posed to Maureen by the defendant that you did. And not one of those people, not one, is to blame for what he did. Last, as to the evidence of the defendant's guilt, let's discuss his failed suicide attempt. It is evidence of what's called consciousness of guilt, the conduct of someone who knows he did wrong. It certainly was not an act of sadness. He was far too self-centered and bitter for that. The same selfishness that played a role in his decision to commit murder also led him to slice open his own wrists and try to take his own life. Taking his own life simply was an easy way out for what he knew he did, the murder of his wife. He knew back on April 4th the verdict that you all will render soon. He does not want to face the consequences of what he did. He tried the coward's way out then to avoid responsibility and punishment for the murder that he knew he committed. Now, his only avenue is once again blaming Maureen, this time in this farce claim of suicide. None of what the defendant did after failing to take his own life are the actions of someone overcome by grief and shock. It's the continued callous and selfish acts of a murderer. He was so unfazed by his own actions and the lifeless body that he left behind literally to rot in the family house until someone came across her, as to take her phone, her car, and her money. Doing what he has done so long to his family in the past, abandoning them, focusing on himself. To use his own words, as his friend Ray Karen heard on the tape, as did you, it's time for me to be selfish. Such callousness consistent with the murder he committed is borne out not only in what he did do after the murder, but also what he did not do. No calls for medical assistance to his wife, no calls to his or her family members, a total lack of common decency to notify those who would truly care and grieve of Maureen's death. He didn't do any of that because he didn't care. None of those obvious and simple steps taken by a truly mourning spouse ever entered his spiteful, selfish mind. Which is why he didn't finish the job on himself when, to his surprise, he did not bleed out. He chose to go out on his own terms a different way, with his two true loves, himself and gambling. And he used his dead wife's money to finance it. Or maybe, always the gambler, he figured his luck had turned. Like many self-centered egomaniacs, he figured he could charm his way out of it to you, badmouth the victim some more, maybe shed some tears, I couldn't tell. Trying to explain why he didn't completely close the murder-suicide loop also seeks some rationality for patently irrational acts. Murdering one's spouse, abandoning one's children. He was not acting rationally. That doesn't mean that he did not know or intend what he was doing when he killed Maureen. Nor does it mean that he did not commit purposeful first-degree murder, which transitions into what we want to spend our last 10 or 15 minutes talking to you about. The charges, and primarily the first-degree murder charge. Briefly, as to the falsification charge, that is his removal of Maureen's cell phone from 118 West Road and later his disposal of it. And here you saw the cell tower data and maps. He clearly had her phone, he took it into the house, and then he disposed of it in the Nashua area on his way to Connecticut. And he not only had her cell phone, he used it. From cell phone data, he had the cell phone with him when he drove his truck to that Home Depot and when he drove back. And then he took the phone with him into the house when he returned, where he used it to send that ruse text message to Maureen's brother while she lay dead in bed. And you heard his lies here as well. Maureen's phone ran out of power. The same phone that he said was in the charger when he took it. And according to his story, it lost power half an hour after he left the house for Connecticut, where he disposed of it in Nashua. And I suppose anyone would do that when a cell phone runs out of power, right? Threw it away. It's nonsense. You know why he really got rid of Maureen's phone. The same reason he got rid of his own phone. The dozens of cell phone-based messages between he and her in the weeks and days leading to her death. Words that he wrote to her, the target of his anger and resentment while the relationship was ending. Those certainly weren't love words he was sending to her. Her words sent to him of her pending plans, fears, concerns. He did not want the cell phone around to recover those words. So he got rid of it by discarding the phone, just as callously as he had left her body behind in the house. And that is the falsification charge. And that charge also is evidence of cover-up, showing that he committed purposeful first-degree murder. Let's turn to that charge. First-degree murder requires proof that he killed Maureen purposely. And as to evidence of that mental state, keep in mind here that we are not arguing that he planned or plotted Maureen's death to occur when it did, or even the day that it did. And that is not needed for first-degree murder. What is needed is a conscious object to cause Maureen's death, and that he did so with premeditation and deliberation. And the judge soon will define these concepts for you, and will also set forth factors that you may consider when determining them. First off, relevant here, you have all the statements of hostility and anger aimed at the victim. How much he despised her, how much he wanted to rid himself of her, feelings of hatred that had been building for months. And for him, those feelings only became more pronounced as the marriage reached its end. His life spiraling further downward, her life ascending, and he knew it. That evening, the last of Maureen's alive, that reality continued to set in for him. Maureen was not just talking about leaving. She was going to do it. He had nothing, he would have nothing. And he acted on that resentment, anger, jealousy, and hatred that he had harbored for so long. And he committed murder that is first-degree murder by its very nature. Prolonged physical force, with full knowledge of what he was doing, and with full intention to cause the death of Maureen that he knew would result. The defendant's solicitation efforts only a little over a month before the murder, asking a friend to help kill or find someone to kill Maureen, is more proof that his ultimate act of violence against her was purposeful murder. It shows not only that he thought about killing Maureen well in advance, but also that he was serious enough about his hostile and violent intentions that he actually acted on them. He took the time to arrange a meeting, and he took the time to place offers on the table. Again, we are not arguing that he committed murder on the night of April, that night in April, a little over a month later, for the insurance money. He killed her as everything came to a head for him. He acted on his previously expressed intentions to kill. He was motivated by all that we have talked to you about before. His purposeful mental state, also established by his post-murder conduct. His attempts to cover up the crime, from lies to destroying evidence, and the callousness that he exhibited time and time again. And that purposeful mental state for first-degree murder also is proven by the manner in which he killed his wife. Whether smothering or strangulation, his chosen method of homicide employed a necessary element central to first-degree murder. Time. Time. It took him a long time to ultimately kill Maureen. And in the time it took to extinguish her life, she was unconscious and utterly defenseless. But he kept the pressure on. Seconds, just seconds, to incapacitate Maureen, but much, much longer to take her life. That was just 30 seconds. The murderous intent for purposeful first-degree murder can form in moments. From the instructions that you'll be hearing shortly, the intent can form in, quote, a very short period of time. It took him minutes to kill his wife. Time during which he had his victim's death on his mind. time during which he was concentrated on that desired goal, time in which he could have changed his mind. He easily could have released that hold, as simple as that. You heard from the doctor. But he did not. He chose not to. He chose to kill. The determination and singular focus of purpose to kill that he exhibited is the equivalent not just of a single or even a couple gunshot wounds or stab wounds, but over and over and over again to ensure the desired objective, death, is achieved. That is purposeful first-degree murder under the law. It was not an impulsive, violent act. It was intentional follow-through of all of his murderous thoughts and feelings up to that point. And also here, the evidence all points to the fact that Maureen was asleep when he murdered her. This was not a situation where they were arguing and it escalated and he struck out at her at the heat of the moment. Here, it was very different. The culmination of months thinking about what he ultimately chose to do, take her life, in time to further think about what he was about to do while she slept, in time to go down that murderous path. The defendant purposely killed Maureen, his wife, the mother of his children. He did exactly what he told others he wanted to do. He would not let her live her life. She was so close. She almost got away. Find him guilty of the life he took. Find him guilty of purposeful first-degree murder.
Thank you, Attorney Hinckley. Ladies and gentlemen, due to the hour, I'm going to ask you to take a short recess, stretch your legs, and use the restroom. And when you come back, we'll finish up the trial with the jury instructions and the other administrative issues. Thank you.
All rise, please.